My husband's new wife came to my door with a greedy smirk. She said, "We're here for our rightful share of your father's estate. Move out immediately." I smiled as my lawyer walked in behind her. The color drained from her face as attorney Rebecca Morrison stepped into my doorway, her briefcase in hand and that professional smile that had won countless cases. My ex-husband Derek stood behind his new bride Vanessa, suddenly looking less confident than when they'd approached my father's house just minutes ago. I'm Elizabeth Carter, 34 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed my marriage of 8 years was solid. I believed my husband loved me. I believed the woman he introduced as his business associate was actually helping him with his marketing firm. I was wrong about all 3 things. What they didn't know as they stood on my doorstep demanding my inheritance was that I had been preparing for this exact moment since the day I discovered Derek's betrayal, since the day my father passed away leaving me everything, and since the day Vanessa started making calls to probate lawyers thinking I wouldn't find out. The past 3 months had been a masterclass in grief, divorce, and strategic planning. My father, Thomas Carter, had been a careful man, a real estate investor who built his wealth slowly and deliberately over 40 years. When he died of a sudden heart attack, he left me his entire estate, this 4-bedroom colonial house in Westchester, a small but profitable commercial property downtown, and enough investments to ensure I'd never have to work again if I chose not to. What he also left me was a letter warning me about people who might come seeking what wasn't theirs. Derek and I had separated 2 months before my father died. I'd discovered his affair with Vanessa when I found hotel receipts in his jacket pocket, receipts dated during the same weekends he claimed to be at business conferences. Vanessa worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, which explained how she seemed to know just enough about inheritance law to be dangerous, but not enough to understand how badly she was about to lose. They'd married quickly, almost suspiciously so, just 3 weeks after our divorce was finalized. I'd signed the papers without contest, taking nothing from our marriage except my personal belongings and my maiden name back. Derek had seemed relieved, probably thinking I was too broken-hearted to fight. He had no idea I was playing a longer game. The morning they showed up at my door, I was in my father's study, going through the last of his papers with Rebecca. We'd been reviewing the estate documents when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I'd seen Derek's silver Mercedes parked in my driveway, and my stomach had clenched with that familiar mixture of anger and vindication. This was it. The moment Rebecca had predicted would come. "Mrs. Carter," Vanessa had said with that smirk when I opened the door, deliberately using Derek's last name to assert some kind of dominance. "We need to discuss the inheritance situation. As Derek's wife, I have certain rights to assets acquired during your marriage to him, and we've consulted with a lawyer who says we have a strong case for claiming at least half of your father's estate." I'd let her finish her speech, watching Derek shift uncomfortably behind her. He at least had the decency to look somewhat ashamed, though whether it was shame over the affair or shame over this blatant money grab, I couldn't tell. That's when I'd smiled and stepped back, allowing them to see Rebecca standing in the hallway behind me. "I'm attorney Rebecca Morrison," she said, her voice pleasant but with an edge of steel. "I represent Ms. Carter in all matters relating to the Thomas Carter estate. Would you like to come in and discuss this properly, or would you prefer to continue making legal threats on the doorstep where all the neighbors can hear?" Vanessa's smirk faltered. Derek's face went pale. What is this?" Vanessa stammered, her confidence evaporating like morning fog. "This," I said, my voice calm and measured, "is what happens when you assume someone is weak just because they're grieving. Please come in. I think it's time we had a very honest conversation about inheritance, betrayal, and the consequences of greed." They followed us into the living room, their earlier swagger completely gone. Rebecca set her briefcase on my father's antique coffee table and pulled out a thick folder of documents. I sat in my father's favorite armchair, the leather one that still smelled faintly of his cologne, and watched as the lawyer in Vanessa tried to maintain composure while the gold digger in her started to panic. "Let's start with the basics," Rebecca began, pulling out the first document. "The Thomas Carter estate. Ms. Carter's father died intestate. Actually, no, I'm sorry, that's incorrect. Let me rephrase. Mr. Carter had a very detailed will, drafted and updated regularly over the past 15 years. Would you like to know what it says?" Derek cleared his throat. "Elizabeth, we didn't come here to fight. We just think that since your father's estate increased significantly during our marriage, partially due to investments I advised him on." "Stop," I said quietly, but with enough force that he immediately fell silent. "Don't you dare pretend you had anything to do with my father's success. You gave him one stock tip in 2018 that lost him $12,000. He never asked your advice again." The truth was, Derek had always resented my father's wealth. During our marriage, he'd frequently complained that Thomas was holding out on us, that he should be more generous with loans and investments in Derek's failing ventures. What Derek never understood was that my father had seen through him from day one, had warned me against marrying him, and had spent our entire marriage making sure his assets were protected from exactly this scenario. Vanessa pulled out her phone. "I'm calling our lawyer." "Please do," Rebecca said pleasantly. "I'd love to speak with whoever gave you such spectacularly bad legal advice. But while you're doing that, let me explain a few things about inheritance law in this state." Rebecca opened her briefcase with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. She pulled out a stack of documents, each one carefully tabbed and organized. Vanessa's fingers hovered over her phone screen, but she hadn't actually dialed yet. She was too busy watching Rebecca lay out page after page of legal paperwork on the coffee table. "First," Rebecca began, her tone educational but with an unmistakable edge, "let's clarify clarify something about marital property and inheritance. In New York State, inheritance received by one spouse during a marriage is considered separate property, not marital property. This means that even if Elizabeth had still been married to Derek when her father passed, the estate would have been hers alone. No claim, no division, no sharing. Derek shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. But we were married when Thomas made most of his investments. Those grew during our marriage. Irrelevant, Rebecca said flatly. Inheritance is separate property regardless of appreciation during marriage. That's basic estate law, Mr. Carter. Any paralegal worth her certification should know that. She glanced meaningfully at Vanessa, who had gone very still. I watched Vanessa's face carefully. The greedy smirk was completely gone now, replaced by something that looked like dawning horror. She was beginning to realize that whatever lawyer had encouraged this scheme had either been incompetent or had never existed at all. Second, Rebecca continued, pulling out another document, Elizabeth and Derek's divorce was finalized on March 15th. Thomas Carter passed away on May 22nd. That's more than 2 months after the divorce was final. Even if inheritance could somehow be claimed as marital property, which it can't, Derek ceased to be Elizabeth's spouse more than 60 days before Thomas died. He has no legal standing whatsoever. This is ridiculous, Vanessa said, finally finding her voice. Derek told me that Elizabeth tried to hide assets during the divorce, that she rushed the proceedings specifically so she could inherit everything without sharing it. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It was a sharp, bitter sound that surprised even me. Is that the story he told you? That I rushed our divorce? I looked directly at Derek. Tell her the truth. Tell her who filed first and why. Derek's jaw clenched. He said nothing. I'll tell her then, I said, leaning forward. Derek filed for divorce in January, not me. Him. He filed because he wanted to marry you, Vanessa. He was the one who wanted it done quickly. He pushed for the 60-day waiting period to be waived. He agreed to all my terms without negotiation because he was so eager to start his new life with his paralegal girlfriend. I paused, letting that sink in. My father wasn't even sick yet. None of us knew he had a heart condition. Derek didn't rush the divorce to avoid sharing an inheritance that didn't exist yet. He rushed it because he was in love. The look Vanessa shot at Derek could have stripped paint off walls. You told me she was stalling. You said she was refusing to sign. I signed the same day the papers were delivered, I said quietly. I didn't contest anything. I didn't ask for alimony even though I was entitled to it after 8 years of marriage. I took nothing but my clothes, my books, and my grandmother's jewelry. Derek got to keep the condo we bought together, the car I helped pay for, and all the furniture. I walked away clean because I wanted nothing from him. Rebecca pulled out another document. This is the divorce decree. As you can see, there's no mention of any Carter family assets because Elizabeth deliberately kept her father's finances completely separate from her marital finances throughout the entire marriage. Very wise, as it turns out. My father insisted on it, I said, remembering those conversations. When Derek and I got engaged, my father sat me down and explained that he'd worked too hard building his estate to see it dissolved in a potential divorce. He made me promise to keep separate bank accounts, to never commingle assets, to maintain financial independence. At the time, I thought he was being paranoid and unromantic. Now I understand he was being protective and realistic. Derek finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. So that's it? 8 years of marriage and I get nothing while you inherit millions? You got exactly what you asked for in the divorce, I replied. And yes, that's it. That's how inheritance law works. Were you expecting something different? Vanessa stood up abruptly, her professional composure completely shattered. This is insane. We consulted with a lawyer who said we had options, that we could challenge the estate distribution, that there were precedents for spouses claiming. What lawyer? Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. Give me a name and a firm. Vanessa hesitated, and in that hesitation, the truth became obvious. There was no lawyer. Or if there was, they'd given such terrible advice that Vanessa didn't want to name them and expose her own gullibility. I thought so, Rebecca said. Let me guess. You Googled, can ex-spouse claim inheritance, and found some blog post or forum discussion that gave you false hope. Or maybe Derek told you what you wanted to hear because he was embarrassed to admit he walked away from his marriage with nothing while his ex-wife became a millionaire. The silence that followed was excruciating. I could see Derek and Vanessa processing this, could see the reality settling over them like a heavy blanket. They had come here expecting to intimidate me, to pressure me into some kind of settlement, to walk away with at least a portion of my father's estate. Instead, they were learning that they had no legal ground to stand on, no leverage, and no case. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She pulled out yet another document, this one thicker than the others. Now, she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, let's talk about what happens next. Elizabeth could simply send you away with this information and consider the matter closed. However, given that you came to her home making threats about rightful shares and demanding she leave property that belongs entirely to her, we need to address the harassment and intimidation. Harassment? Derek repeated. We just came to talk. You came to threaten? I corrected. Vanessa's exact words were, move out immediately. That's not a conversation starter. That's a demand based on a false claim of legal right. In front of witnesses, you attempted to coerce me into abandoning my inheritance. Vanessa's face had gone from pale to red. We didn't threaten anyone. We just wanted to discuss the situation. Rebecca held up her phone. I recorded your entire conversation at the door. New York is a one-party consent state, meaning I only needed my own consent to record you. Would you like me to play it back? The part where you claimed you had rights to this estate? The part where you ordered Elizabeth to leave her own home? The panic was visible now on both their faces. They were beginning to understand that they hadn't just just made a social mistake or an embarrassing error in judgment. They had potentially crossed into legal territory that could have consequences. "What do you want?" Derek asked, and I heard the defeat in his voice. I looked at him. This man I'd loved for so many years. This man who had shared my bed and my life and my dreams. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing except a cold, clear certainty about what needed to happen next. "I want you to leave," I said simply. "I want you to never contact me again about my father's estate or any other financial matter. I want you to understand that you made your choices, Derek. You chose to have an affair. You chose to file for divorce. You chose to remarry quickly. You chose to come here today, making claims you had no right to make. And now I'm choosing to protect myself and my father's legacy from people who only see dollar signs when they look at me." Rebecca added, "If you attempt to contact Elizabeth again regarding the estate, if you make any public statements about having rights to this property, if you engage in any behavior that could be construed as harassment or intimidation, we will pursue legal action. That could include a restraining order, a civil lawsuit for harassment, and depending on what you say or do, possibly criminal charges for attempted fraud or extortion." "Extortion?" Vanessa gasped. "That's insane. We're not criminals." "Then don't act like ones," Rebecca replied coolly. "Leave this property. Don't come back. Don't call. Don't email. Don't send messages through mutual friends. Elizabeth has made it clear she wants no contact with either of you. Respect that boundary." Derek stood slowly, and I could see him trying to think of something to say, some argument that might change the situation. But there was nothing left to argue. The law was clear, the facts were undeniable, and his attempt to claim what wasn't his had failed spectacularly. "I never thought you'd be this cold," he said finally, looking at me with something that might have been genuine hurt. "We were married for 8 years, Elizabeth. I loved you once. Doesn't that count for something?" The question hung in the air between us, weighted with years of shared history and recent betrayal. I thought about all the times I'd covered for him when he forgot important dates, all the business ventures I'd helped fund that went nowhere, all the nights I'd waited up worried while he was actually in hotel rooms with Vanessa. I thought about my father's funeral, which Derek had attended with Vanessa on his arm just 3 weeks after their wedding, showing no respect for my grief or the circumstances. "You loved me once," I agreed quietly, "and then you loved someone else, and now you love my money. So no, Derek, it doesn't count for something. Not anymore." They left then, Vanessa practically dragging Derek toward the door. I watched from the window as they got into that silver Mercedes, watched them sit in my driveway for several long minutes having what looked like a heated argument, and then finally watched them drive away. Rebecca began gathering her documents, organizing them back into her briefcase with the same precision she'd used to lay them out. "That went exactly as predicted," she said with satisfaction. "I told you they'd come, and I told you they'd have no case. The recording is just insurance." "Do you think they'll actually try something else?" I asked, suddenly feeling exhausted now that the confrontation was over. "No," Rebecca said confidently. "They're embarrassed and angry, but they're not stupid enough to push this further. They know they have no legal standing, and now they know we're prepared to pursue harassment charges if they continue. They'll complain to their friends, they'll paint you as the villain in their version of the story, but they'll leave you alone." I sank back into my father's chair, feeling the weight of the past hour settling over me. "I wish he was here," I said quietly. "My dad. He would have handled this so much better than me. He would have known exactly what to say to make them understand. He prepared you for this," Rebecca reminded me gently. "All those conversations about protecting your assets, keeping your finances separate, understanding estate law. He knew this day might come, and he made sure you'd be ready for it. That's love, Elizabeth. Real love. Not the kind that comes with conditions and demands." She was right, of course. My father had loved me enough to ensure I'd be protected even after he was gone. He'd loved me enough to teach me to be strong, to stand up for myself, to not let anyone take what was rightfully mine. Derek had never loved me that way. Looking back now with clarity that only betrayal can bring, I wasn't sure Derek had ever really loved me at all. But the day wasn't over yet, and neither was my story with Derek and Vanessa. What they didn't know, what even Rebecca didn't fully understand yet, was that their visit today had triggered something I'd been planning for weeks, something that would make their failed attempt to claim my inheritance seem like a minor embarrassment compared to what was coming next. 3 days after Derek and Vanessa's failed attempt to claim my inheritance, I sat in Rebecca's downtown office reviewing documents that would change everything. The morning sun streamed through her floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the papers spread across her mahogany desk. These weren't estate documents anymore. These were something far more interesting. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Rebecca asked, studying my face carefully. "Once we file, there's no going back. This will get ugly." I thought about my father's letter, the one he'd left for me in his safe deposit box along with his will. I'd read it so many times in the past 3 months that I had it memorized. "Elizabeth," he'd written in his careful handwriting, "if you're reading this, I'm gone. I'm sorry I won't be there to protect you anymore. But I've left you tools to protect yourself. Use them wisely. Don't let anyone take what you've earned through grief and loss. And remember, being kind doesn't mean being weak. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is show people the consequences of their choices." "I'm certain," I told Rebecca. "File everything." She nodded and began organizing the documents. What Derek and Vanessa didn't know when they showed up at my door was that I'd been investigating them since before my father's death, not out of spite initially, but out of curiosity. When Derek filed for divorce so suddenly, I'd wanted to understand why. What I discovered was far more complex and damaging than a simple affair. It started when I hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen. I'd found him through a recommendation from Rebecca, who'd used his services in several divorce cases. Marcus was thorough, discreet, and frighteningly good at his job. What he uncovered in 6 weeks of investigation was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond infidelity. Derek's marketing firm, which I'd helped him establish with a $20,000 loan from my savings 7 years ago, was failing. Not just struggling, but actively collapsing under the weight of bad decisions and worse management. He'd taken out multiple business loans using fraudulent income projections, borrowed money from 3 different investors promising returns he couldn't deliver, and worst of all, he'd been skimming money from client accounts to cover his gambling debts. Yes, gambling debts. Derek had developed a serious poker problem over the past 2 years, spending his weekends at underground games in Manhattan rather than at the business conferences he claimed to attend. He'd lost over $80,000, money he'd taken from client accounts and his business operating expenses. His firm was weeks away from collapse, and several of his clients were beginning to ask questions about missing funds. Vanessa had been more than his mistress. She'd been his accomplice. As a paralegal, she'd helped him create false documentation to cover his tracks, forge client signatures, and set up shell corporations to hide money. She wasn't just sleeping with my husband. She was actively participating in defrauding his clients and investors. Marcus had gathered bank statements, emails, text messages, photographs of Derek at illegal poker games, and testimony from 2 of his former employees who'd been fired when they started asking questions about the finances. It was a comprehensive case of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The district attorney is very interested, Rebecca said, pulling out another file. Once we hand over Marcus's investigation to them, they'll likely open a criminal inquiry. Derek's clients will also have grounds for civil lawsuits. We're talking potential criminal charges, financial ruin, and possibly prison time. And Vanessa? I asked. As a paralegal who helped create false legal documents, she's looking at potential disbarment from ever working in law again, plus her own criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. The state bar takes this kind of thing very seriously. I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction? Yes, but also something like sadness. Not for Derek or Vanessa, but for the person I used to be. The woman who'd loved a man who turned out to be a stranger. The woman who'd trusted so completely that she never saw the lies. There's something else, Rebecca said, pulling out a final document. The loan you gave Derek to start his business. You never formalized it with proper documentation, correct? He said we didn't need paperwork between husband and wife, I replied, remembering that conversation. He promised he'd pay me back once the business was profitable. That's what I thought. Fortunately, you did write him a check with business loan in the memo line, and we have the bank records showing the transfer. That creates a legal debt, even without formal documentation. Given that Derek is about to face financial ruin from lawsuits and potential criminal charges, we should file a creditor's claim against his assets immediately. His condo, his car, his business assets, whatever's left. You'll be first in line as a creditor, ahead of his other victims. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek had come to claim my inheritance, and now I was going to claim everything he had left. But this wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about justice. It was about making sure that Derek and Vanessa faced real consequences for their actions, not just the embarrassment of a failed money grab. Do it, I said. File the creditor's claim and contact the district attorney. It's time Derek and Vanessa learned that actions have consequences. Over the next 2 weeks, things moved quickly. The district attorney's office opened an official investigation into Derek's business practices. 4 of his clients filed civil lawsuits for embezzlement and fraud. The state bar began proceedings against Vanessa for ethics violations, and my creditor's claim was filed against Derek's assets, effectively freezing everything he owned. I learned about Derek's reaction through mutual friends. He'd apparently had a complete breakdown when the investigators showed up at his office. He'd tried to call me 17 times in one day, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that I saved but never listened to. Vanessa had been fired from her law firm immediately when her involvement became known, and her name was spreading through legal circles as someone who'd betrayed client trust and professional ethics. But the most unexpected development came from Derek's mother, Patricia. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight with emotion. "Elizabeth," she said, "I need to speak with you. Please. I know Derek has done terrible things, but I need you to understand something about what's happening." I almost hung up. Patricia had never liked me during my marriage, always subtly suggesting I wasn't good enough for her son, that I should try harder to support his business dreams, that I was too focused on my own career as a graphic designer. But something in her voice made me pause. "What is it, Patricia?" I asked carefully. "Derek is talking about suicide," she said bluntly. "He says his life is over, that he'll go to prison, that he's lost everything. His father and I are terrified. We know he's brought this on himself, but he's still our son. I'm not asking you to drop the charges or the lawsuit. I'm just asking if there's any way to, I don't know, show mercy somehow." I sat in silence for a long moment, processing this. Suicide. The word hung heavy between us. Despite everything Derek had done, despite the betrayal and the lies and the attempted theft of my inheritance, I didn't want him dead. I wanted him to face consequences, to feel remorse, to understand the pain he'd caused, but I didn't want him to die. "Patricia," I said slowly, "I'm not the one pressing criminal charges. That's the district attorney. I didn't create Derek's gambling problem or his fraud or his embezzlement. I didn't make him steal from his clients. Those are his choices. And now he's facing the legal consequences of those choices. That's not cruelty. That's justice. But the creditor's claim. name, she pressed. You're taking everything he has left. His home, his car, everything. Can't you show some compassion? You're going to inherit millions from your father. Do you really need to destroy Derek completely? And there it was, the same mentality that Derek and Vanessa had shown when they came to my door. The assumption that because I had money from my inheritance, I should be generous with it. That I should absorb the losses and let Derek keep what little he had left, even though he owed me $20,000 from 7 years ago and had tried to steal my inheritance just weeks earlier. My father's money doesn't erase Derek's debt to me, I said firmly. He borrowed $20,000 and never paid it back. Now he's facing financial ruin from his own criminal behavior. And as a creditor, I have every legal right to try to recover what he owes me. That's not revenge, Patricia. That's basic contract law. You've changed, she said, and I could hear the disapproval in her voice. You used to be such a sweet, understanding girl. This money has made you hard. I felt anger flash through me, hot and bright. No, I said sharply. Your son's betrayal made me strong. There's a difference. And if Derek is genuinely suicidal, then he needs psychiatric help, not financial rescue. Get him into treatment. Get him a therapist. But don't ask me to sacrifice my legal rights because he's finally facing consequences for his actions. Patricia hung up without another word. I sat holding the phone, wondering if I'd been too harsh. But then I remembered Derek's smirk as he stood on my doorstep with Vanessa, remembered his casual assumption that he could claim my father's estate, remembered all the lies and the cheating and the years of subtle manipulation. No, I hadn't been too harsh. I'd been exactly as firm as the situation required. Rebecca called that evening with more news. The DA's office wants to meet with you tomorrow. They're building a case against Derek and Vanessa, and they need your testimony about the timeline of events. Also, one of Derek's former clients wants to speak with you. Her name is Margaret Chen. She says Derek embezzled $30,000 from her small business account, and she's grateful you came forward with the investigation. I agreed to both meetings. The next day, I sat in the district attorney's office, telling my story to a prosecutor named James Walsh. He was methodical and thorough, taking notes on every detail of my marriage to Derek, the divorce, the attempted inheritance claim, and what I knew about his business practices. Your investigation was incredibly helpful, he said. Most fraud cases like this take months to build. Your private investigator handed us everything we needed on a silver platter. We're looking at multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. If convicted, Derek could face up to 20 years in federal prison. 20 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. I'd wanted Derek to face consequences, but the reality of what that meant was suddenly overwhelming. 20 years of his life gone. His reputation destroyed forever. His freedom taken away. Is there? I hesitated, not sure if I should even ask. Is there any possibility of a plea deal? Something that might involve restitution and probation instead of prison time? James studied me carefully. Why would you want that after everything he did to you? I don't want it for him, I said slowly, working through my own complicated feelings. But I don't want his potential death on my conscience either. His mother says he's suicidal. If there's a way for him to make things right without destroying his entire life, maybe that's worth considering. Not because he deserves mercy, but because I deserve peace. James nodded thoughtfully. That's surprisingly compassionate of you. But understand something, Elizabeth. Derek didn't just hurt you. He stole from at least 7 other people that we know of. Small business owners, retirees, people who trusted him with their money. They deserve justice too. A plea deal would need to involve significant restitution to all his victims, not just you. I understand, I said. I'm just saying that if he's willing to cooperate, to return what he stole, to truly make amends, maybe there's a path that doesn't involve 2 decades in prison. After the DA's office, I met with Margaret Chen in a small coffee shop near the courthouse. She was a woman in her 60s, owner of a small import business. Derek had convinced her to let him manage her company's marketing accounts, then systematically drained $30,000 over 6 months. I almost lost my business, she told me, tears in her eyes. I've worked for 40 years to build it. When I discovered the money was gone, I didn't know what to do. The police said it was a civil matter. My own lawyer said it would cost more to sue than I'd recover. I thought I was going to lose everything because I trusted the wrong person. Listening to her story made my own losses seem smaller by comparison. Yes, Derek had betrayed me emotionally and tried to steal my inheritance, but Margaret had nearly lost her livelihood, her life's work, because of his greed. I'm so sorry, I said. If I'd known what he was doing earlier, maybe I could have stopped him before he hurt you. She shook her head. You're not responsible for his choices, but thank you for coming forward with the investigation. The prosecutor says because of your evidence, I'll actually have a chance at recovering my money now. That means everything to me. Walking home that evening, I felt the full weight of what I'd set in motion. This wasn't just about Derek and Vanessa anymore. It was about justice for everyone they'd harmed. It was about sending a message that betrayal and fraud have real consequences. It was about protecting future victims from people who saw others only as resources to exploit. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Please, it read. We need to talk. What I did was wrong, but there's more to the story than you know. Things that explain everything. Meet me tomorrow. I'll tell you the truth about why this all happened. D. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Derek wanted to explain. He wanted to tell his side of the story. Part of me, the part that had loved him for 8 years, wanted to know, wanted to understand how the man I'd married had become someone capable of such systematic betrayal. But another part of me, the stronger part that my father had helped build, knew that explanations reasons weren't the same as excuses, that understanding Derek's motivations wouldn't change what he'd done or the consequences he needed to face. I blocked the number without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having. Some explanations didn't matter anymore. What I didn't know then was that Derek's cryptic message about more to the story was actually true. There were secrets still buried, connections I hadn't discovered, and a final revelation that would make everything I'd learned so far seem simple by comparison. The call came at 2 in the morning, jolting me from a restless sleep. I fumbled for my phone, heart pounding, expecting some emergency. The caller ID showed Marcus Chen, my private investigator. Elizabeth, his voice was urgent. I need you to meet me at my office first thing in the morning. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not Rebecca, not the DA, no one until we speak. I've found something and it changes everything. What are you talking about? I asked, now fully awake. What did you find? Not over the phone, he said firmly. 8 o'clock, my office. Trust me, you need to see this in person. He hung up before I could ask anything else. I lay in the darkness, mind racing through possibilities. What could Marcus have discovered that was so urgent he'd call in the middle of the night? The investigation into Derek and Vanessa was already comprehensive. What more could there be? I barely slept the rest of the night. At 7:45, I was sitting in my car outside Marcus's office building, a nondescript structure in Midtown. He buzzed me up at exactly 8 o'clock, and when I walked into his office, I found him looking exhausted, like he'd been up all night. Coffee? He offered, gesturing to a fresh pot. Answers? I replied. What's going on, Marcus? He pulled out a thick folder and set it on his desk between us. After you asked me to investigate Derek's business practices, I kept digging, partly because I had a hunch there was more to find, partly because some things weren't adding up. The timeline of the fraud, the sophistication of the false documentation, the way the money was being moved through shell corporations. It seemed too complex for Derek to manage on his own, even with Vanessa's help. What are you saying? I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. I'm saying Derek had a partner, someone with more experience in financial fraud, someone who knew how to structure these schemes to avoid detection. He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. Someone like this. I stared at the image. It showed Derek at a restaurant having dinner with a man I'd never seen before. They were leaning close together, papers spread on the table between them. The photo was time-stamped from 18 months ago. Who is he? I asked. His name is Richard Novak, Marcus said, and he's your father's former business partner. The room seemed to tilt. What? My father never mentioned anyone named Richard Novak. That's because they had a very ugly falling out about 20 years ago. I found records of a lawsuit, a dissolved partnership, accusations of embezzlement. Your father bought Novak out and cut all ties. From what I can gather, Novak has spent the past 2 decades building and losing several fortunes through increasingly questionable business ventures. He's been investigated for fraud multiple times, but never charged. My mind was racing, trying to connect these pieces. Are you telling me this man somehow got to Derek? That he what? Recruited him into some kind of scheme? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Marcus said. Look at this. He pulled out bank records showing wire transfers. Derek's gambling debts? They weren't to random poker games, they were to Novak. Derek owed him over $100,000. Novak offered him a way out, help him get access to your father's estate. I felt sick, but my father's estate was locked down. There was no way for Derek to access it, especially after the divorce. Not while your father was alive, Marcus agreed, but Novak knew Thomas Carter had a serious heart condition. He'd apparently been tracking your father's health for years, waiting for an opportunity. When Thomas died and left everything to you, Novak saw his chance. Derek was already in deep with the gambling debts. Novak pressured him to get close to you again, to find a way to claim part of the inheritance. The divorce, I whispered, understanding dawning. Derek filed for divorce suddenly, then remarried Vanessa just as quickly, then showed up at my door demanding part of the estate. That wasn't impulse, that was planned. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. Novak thought if Derek remarried quickly and made a claim on the estate as your former spouse, they might be able to pressure you into a settlement, or create enough legal confusion to tie up the estate in court while they looked for other ways to access the money. Vanessa wasn't just Derek's mistress. She was a legal tool, someone with enough knowledge of estate law to help make the claim seem legitimate. I stood up, pacing the small office, trying to process this information. My father's old enemy had manipulated my husband, destroyed my marriage, and tried to steal my inheritance. It was like something out of a movie, except it was my real life. There's more, Marcus said quietly, and this is the part you really need to prepare yourself for. I turned to face him, dreading whatever was coming next. He pulled out a medical file. I got access to your father's health records. It required some creative investigation, and this technically isn't admissible in court, but you need to know. Your father's heart condition was being treated by a cardiologist named Dr. Stephen Palmer. Dr. Palmer's nurse practitioner is a woman named Karen Novak, Richard Novak's daughter. The implications crashed over me like a wave. No, you can't be suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything yet, Marcus said carefully, but I found communications between Karen Novak and her father discussing your father's health status, his medication regimen, and the severity of his condition. Information that should have been protected by patient confidentiality. She was feeding him information, I said, feeling rage build inside me. She was telling Novak when my father was vulnerable, when he might die soon. It appears that way. Yes, Marcus confirmed, but here's where it gets truly disturbing. Your father died of a sudden heart attack, correct? Massive coronary event, unexpected even given his condition? Yes, I said, my voice barely audible. The doctor said it was surprising because his condition had been stable stable. He'd just had a checkup 2 weeks before and everything looked good. Marcus pulled out another document. This is your father's toxicology report from the autopsy. It shows elevated levels of digoxin, a heart medication. Now, digoxin is commonly prescribed for heart conditions, but in high doses, it can trigger fatal arrhythmias and heart attacks. Your father's prescription was for 0.25 milligrams daily. The levels in his system suggest he ingested somewhere around 2 milligrams, maybe more. I sank back into my chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Are you saying someone poisoned my father? I'm saying the levels don't match his prescription, Marcus said carefully. It could have been an accidental overdose, a mistake in his medication management, but given everything else we've discovered about Novak's involvement with Derek, about Karen Novak's access to your father's medical information, about the timing of his death just before you came into your inheritance. He trailed off, letting me draw my own conclusions. We need to go to the police, I said, my voice shaking. If someone murdered my father, with what evidence? Marcus interrupted. Everything I've gathered about Novak's connection to Derek is circumstantial. The medical records I accessed aren't legally obtained. The toxicology report shows elevated digoxin levels, but that's not proof of murder. It could have been accidental. Even Karen Novak discussing your father's health with her father isn't necessarily criminal, just unethical. So what do we do? I asked, feeling helpless and furious in equal measure. Marcus leaned forward. We use what we know to pressure Derek into telling us the truth. He's facing 20 years in prison right now for fraud and embezzlement. If we can offer him a deal, immunity in exchange for testimony about Novak's involvement, he might talk. And if Derek knows anything about what happened to your father, if he was part of that plan or has evidence, he's our only chance at getting justice. Derek won't help me, I said bitterly. Why would he? Because right now, Derek thinks he's going down for his own crimes, Marcus replied. He doesn't know we've connected him to Novak. He doesn't know we understand the bigger picture. If we show him what we know, if we explain that he's not just a fraudster, but possibly an accomplice to murder, he might be desperate enough to cut a deal. The word murder hung in the air between us. My father. Someone had potentially murdered my father to get access to his money, and my own husband had been part of the plan. I need to talk to Rebecca, I said, my voice hollow. The DA needs to know about this. Agreed, Marcus said. But Elizabeth, prepare yourself. Even if we can prove all of this, even if Derek cooperates and we can build a case against Novak, there's no guarantee of justice. These kinds of cases are incredibly difficult to prosecute. The evidence is circumstantial. The players are smart and experienced. This could take years. I don't care how long it takes, I said, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. If someone killed my father, I will spend the rest of my life making sure they face consequences. By noon, I was sitting in Rebecca's office with Marcus, laying out everything he'd discovered. Rebecca's expression grew darker with each revelation. When we finished, she sat in silence for several long moments. This is much bigger than a fraud case now, she finally said. We're talking about potential murder, conspiracy, medical ethics violations. We need to bring in the authorities, but we also need to be strategic. If we go to the police with what we have right now, they might investigate, but there's not enough for charges. We need Derek's cooperation. How do we get it? I asked. We make him understand that cooperation is his only path to survival, Rebecca said. Right now, the DA is building a case that will put him in prison for decades, but if we can offer him immunity in exchange for testimony against Novak, for information about what really happened to your father, that changes the calculation. Derek becomes a witness instead of a defendant. Will the DA agree to that? Marcus asked. For a potential murder case? For taking down someone like Novak who's evaded prosecution for years? Rebecca nodded slowly. Yes, I think they will, but we need to move carefully. If Novak suspects we're onto him, if he realizes we've made these connections, he could disappear or destroy evidence. My phone buzzed. Another text from an unknown number, but I knew it was Derek. I'd blocked his previous number, but he'd found another way to reach me. Elizabeth, please? I know you hate me. I deserve it, but I need to tell you something about your father's death. Something you don't know. I can't live with this secret anymore. Meet me. 1 hour. The coffee shop on 5th and Main. Come alone. This is about more than just money. I showed the message to Rebecca and Marcus. They exchanged significant looks. He knows something, Marcus said, or he's been told to reach out to you. This could be Novak testing whether you suspect anything, or it could be Derek's conscience finally catching up with him, Rebecca suggested. 18 months of lies and fraud, plus potential involvement in a death, that weighs on people. Do I go? I asked. Not alone, Rebecca said firmly. Marcus will be there watching. I'll be in my office on standby. You'll wear a wire, and you'll be recording everything. If Derek confesses to anything, we'll have it documented. An hour later, I sat in a corner booth at the coffee shop, a small recording device hidden under my shirt, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I couldn't drink. My stomach was churning with anxiety and anger. Through the window, I could see Marcus in his car across the street, watching. Derek walked in looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past few weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. He saw me and hesitated, as if considering whether to run. Then he squared his shoulders and walked over. Thank you for coming, he said, sliding into the booth across from me. His voice was hoarse, exhausted. You said this was about my father, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. Talk. He looked around nervously, then leaned forward. I need you to understand something first. When this all started, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what Novak was planning, so he was going to admit it. Relief and horror flooded through me in equal measure. Tell me everything, I said, from the beginning. And Derek, if you lie to me even once, I walk out and you face everything that's coming to you alone. He took a shaky breath and began talking. And what he told me over the next hour would change everything I thought I knew about my father's death, my marriage, and the depths of Richard Novak's betrayal. Derek's hands trembled as he wrapped them around his coffee cup. He looked at me with eyes full of fear, and something that might have been genuine remorse, though I no longer trusted my ability to read him. I met Richard Novak about 2 years ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. At a poker game in Manhattan. I'd been gambling for about 6 months by then, losing more than I was winning. Novak seemed friendly, interested in my marketing business. He started inviting me to private games, high stakes. I thought I was lucky to be included. You weren't lucky, I said flatly. You were being targeted. He nodded miserably. I figured that out later. The games were rigged. I'd win sometimes, just enough to keep me coming back, but mostly I lost. Within 3 months, I owed Novak $80,000. When I couldn't pay, he made me an offer. He said he knew who my father-in-law was, knew about the Carter estate, knew Thomas had a heart condition and wouldn't live forever. He said if I helped him get access to the inheritance when Thomas died, he'd forgive my debts. And you agreed, I said, disgust thick in my voice. I was desperate, Derek said. The business was failing. I'd already started taking money from client accounts to cover losses. I thought if I could just buy some time, I could fix everything. Novak made it sound simple. Stay married to you. Be supportive when your father died. Convince you to share the inheritance. He said it wasn't really stealing because married couples share assets anyway. Except you divorced me before my father died, I pointed out. That wasn't the plan, Derek said quickly. The original plan was to stay married. But then Novak introduced me to Vanessa. She was working at his lawyer's firm. He knew she had access to legal expertise we'd need. He pushed us together, encouraged the affair. I think he wanted leverage over me, something to control me with. When you found the hotel receipts, everything fell apart. So you filed for divorce, I said. Got remarried quickly, then showed up demanding inheritance based on some imaginary legal theory. That was Novak's backup plan. Yes, Derek admitted. He said, even though we were divorced, if I married again quickly and made a claim, we could create enough legal confusion to force you into a settlement, or at least delay the estate distribution long enough for him to find another angle. He was obsessed with getting Thomas's money. It wasn't just about the amount. It was personal for him, because my father exposed his fraud 20 years ago and destroyed his reputation, I said. This was revenge. Derek looked surprised. You know about their history? I know a lot of things now, I replied coldly. What I want to know is what happened to my father. Your text said you couldn't live with the secret anymore. What secret, Derek? He closed his eyes, and I saw tears leak from the corners. I didn't know until after. I swear I didn't know what Novak was planning. Tell me, I said, my voice hard as steel. Novak's daughter works at your father's cardiologist office. She had access to his medical files, his medication schedules, everything. About 3 months before Thomas died, Novak told me he'd found a way to speed things up. I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was just talking about pressuring the situation somehow. But then Thomas died so suddenly, and the timing was so convenient for Novak's plans, and I started to suspect. Suspect what? I demanded, even though I already knew. That Karen Novak had access to your father's medications, Derek said, his voice breaking. That she could have altered them somehow, increased his digoxin dosage, made it look like a natural heart attack. I didn't have proof. I still don't. But 2 weeks after Thomas died, I overheard Novak on the phone with someone. He was laughing, saying everything had gone perfectly, that the old man never knew what hit him, that sometimes the best revenge is patience. The coffee shop around us seemed to fade away. All I could hear was the roaring in my ears, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding as I processed what Derek had just confirmed. My father had been murdered, deliberately poisoned by someone he'd trusted to help manage his heart condition. You knew, I whispered, my voice shaking with rage. You suspected my father was murdered, and you said nothing. You still tried to claim his estate. You still came to my door with your new wife and demanded money from a man whose death you helped orchestrate. I didn't help, Derek said desperately. I didn't know until after. And by then I was terrified of Novak. He made it clear that if I talked, if I went to the police, he'd make sure I went down for everything. The fraud, the embezzlement, all of it. He had evidence against me. I was trapped. You were complicit, I corrected. And now you're going to help me prove what Novak did, or I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison thinking about my father's last moments. Derek nodded frantically. I'll tell the DA everything. I'll wear a wire. I'll get Novak to talk. Whatever you need. But Elizabeth, you have to protect me. Novak is dangerous. If he thinks I've betrayed him. You should have thought about that before you climbed into bed with a murderer, I said. I pulled out my phone and texted Rebecca. He confessed. Bring the DA. We have what we need. Derek's eyes widened when he saw the text. You're recording this? Every word, I confirmed. That confession about Novak discussing my father's death, about Karen Novak having access to his medications, that's evidence, Derek. And now you're going to help us get more. Within 30 minutes, Rebecca arrived with DA James Walsh and 2 detectives. Derek repeated his story, this time officially, with law enforcement recording every word. They arrested him immediately, not for the fraud charges, but as a material witness in a potential murder investigation. He was placed in protective custody while they built the case against Richard Novak. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of police interviews, warrant applications, and strategic planning. Karen Novak was brought in for questioning and immediately requested a lawyer. Her father Richard disappeared, but authorities issued a warrant for his arrest and began monitoring his known associates. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the other nurses at the cardiologist's office, a woman woman named Patricia Moore, came forward after hearing about the investigation. She told detectives that she'd noticed Karen Novak accessing Thomas Carter's files repeatedly in the weeks before his death, more than was normal for patient care. She'd also seen Karen in the medication storage room on several occasions when she shouldn't have been there. I thought about reporting it, Patricia said during her interview, which Rebecca shared with me, but Karen was the doctor's favorite. I was afraid I'd lose my job over false accusations. I convinced myself I was imagining things, but when I heard about the investigation, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. With Patricia's testimony, Derek's confession, and the toxicology report showing elevated digoxin levels, the DA's office had enough to move forward. They obtained warrants to search Karen Novak's home and computer, and what they found was damning. Email communications between Karen and her father discussing Thomas Carter's condition in detail, including specific information about his medication regimen that should have been confidential. Text messages from Richard Novak to his daughter asking about timing and opportunities. And most critically, a journal in Karen's apartment where she documented her plan to gradually increase Thomas's digoxin levels over several weeks, making the eventual fatal dose seem like a natural progression of his heart condition. She'd written, "No one questions a heart attack in a 72-year-old man with documented cardiac issues. The beauty is in the patience. Small increases over time. By the end, his system will be so saturated that the final dose will trigger complete cardiac failure. Quick, relatively painless, and completely undetectable unless someone specifically looks for overdose, which they won't because there's no reason to suspect anything." Reading those words, seeing the cold calculation behind my father's murder, I felt something inside me break and then harden into something unbreakable. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about a man who'd spent his whole life building something meaningful, who'd loved his daughter enough to protect her even after death, who'd been murdered by people motivated by nothing more than greed and revenge. Richard Novak was arrested 3 days later trying to board a flight to Brazil. He was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and fraud. Karen Novak was charged with first-degree murder. Derek, in exchange for his cooperation, received immunity on the murder charges but still faced prosecution for his fraud and embezzlement crimes. Vanessa, who had been unaware of the murder plot but complicit in the fraud scheme, was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and disbarred from ever working as a paralegal again. She'd been a tool, useful to both Derek and Novak, and now she faced the consequences of her choices. The trial took 8 months to prepare. During that time, I sold my father's commercial property and used part of the proceeds to establish a foundation in his name, supporting small business owners who'd been victims of fraud. Margaret Chen became the foundation's first board member, her experience making her a powerful advocate for other victims. I also used some of the money to help Derek's other victims recover their losses, not because I felt sorry for Derek, but because these people deserved restitution, and waiting for the legal system to sort through bankruptcy proceedings could take years they didn't have. When the trial finally began, I sat in the courtroom every single day. I watched as prosecutor after prosecutor laid out the evidence of the conspiracy. I listened as Derek testified about how Novak had manipulated him, used his gambling debts as leverage, and slowly pulled him into an increasingly criminal scheme. I saw Karen Novak's face when they played recordings of her conversations with her father, discussing my father's death as if it were a business transaction. Richard Novak maintained his innocence throughout, claiming he'd never instructed his daughter to harm anyone, that any discussions of Thomas Carter were merely curiosity about an old business rival, that Derek was lying to save himself. His lawyers painted him as a victim of coincidence and circumstantial evidence, but the jury saw through it. They deliberated for 6 days before returning with their verdict. Richard Novak, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of fraud, guilty of racketeering. Karen Novak, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. Karen Novak received 25 years to life. Richard Novak received 30 years without possibility of parole, given his age and leadership role in the conspiracy. Derek, despite his cooperation, received 8 years for the fraud charges, though he'd be eligible for parole in 5. Vanessa received 3 years, most of which she'd already served while awaiting trial. I felt no triumph as I watched them led away in chains. I felt no satisfaction in their punishment. All I felt was a profound sense of loss for the father who should have been there to see justice served, and a quiet determination to honor his memory by living a life he would have been proud of. 2 years after the trial ended, I stood in the renovated offices of the Thomas Carter Foundation, watching as Margaret Chen presented a check for $50,000 to a small business owner named James Rodriguez. James had been defrauded by his accountant and nearly lost his family restaurant. Our foundation had helped him recover, reorganize, and rebuild. "This is what second chances look like," Margaret said to the small crowd gathered for the presentation. "This is what justice in action means." I smiled, remembering how my father used to say that wealth was only meaningful if it helped others build their own success. He'd lived by that principle, investing in small businesses, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and never forgetting where he came from. Now his legacy was doing the same. The foundation had helped 37 business owners in the past 18 months. We'd recovered over $2 million for fraud victims and provided education programs on financial protection and due diligence. It wasn't bringing my father back, but it was honoring everything he'd believed in. My personal life had transformed as well. I'd sold the large colonial house, unable to live there after learning it had been the target of a murder conspiracy. Instead, I purchased a smaller townhouse in the city, something that felt like mine rather than an inheritance. I'd returned to graphic design, taking on select clients and projects that interested me rather than working out of financial necessity. Rebecca had become more than my lawyer. She was now one of my closest friends, someone who understood the complexity of what I'd been through and never tried to minimize it with platitudes about forgiveness or moving on. "You're allowed to still be angry," she'd told me one evening over wine. "You're allowed to never forgive Derek or feel sorry for him. People who betray you don't get to dictate your emotional response." Derek was serving his sentence at a medium security facility upstate. He'd written me several letters over the past 2 years, each one expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness. I'd read the first few, then stopped opening them. Whatever healing Derek needed to do was his own journey. I owed him nothing, not my time, not my forgiveness, not even my anger anymore. He'd simply become irrelevant to my life. Patricia, Derek's mother, had tried to maintain contact for the first year after the trial. She'd sent cards, made phone calls, even showed up at my door once asking if we could talk about reconciliation. I'd been firm, but not cruel. "Patricia," I'd said, "your son participated in a conspiracy that led to my father's murder. He tried to steal my inheritance. He lied to me for years. There's nothing to reconcile. I don't hate Derek anymore, but I also don't want him or anyone connected to him in my life. That includes you. Please respect that boundary." She'd never contacted me again. Vanessa had been released after serving her full sentence. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to Arizona and was working as a waitress, unable to find employment in any legal capacity due to her disbarment. I felt nothing about that information. Not satisfaction, not pity, just indifference. She'd made her choices and was living with the consequences. Karen Novak would likely die in prison. She'd lost her medical license, her freedom, and any chance at the life she might have built. Her father, Richard, now 78 years old, was in a maximum security facility where his health was deteriorating rapidly. He'd suffered a stroke 6 months into his sentence and was now partially paralyzed. The man who'd spent 20 years plotting revenge against my father had ended up destroying himself and his daughter in the process. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard Novak had been so consumed with getting revenge for a decades-old business dispute that he'd murdered a man, corrupted his own daughter, manipulated countless others, and ultimately lost everything that mattered. All for money he'd never get to spend and revenge that brought him nothing but his own destruction. Sometimes I thought about what my father would say about all of it. He'd always been a pragmatic man, someone who believed in consequences and accountability, but not in dwelling on past wrongs. I imagined he'd be proud of the foundation, proud of how I'd stood up for justice, but he'd also probably tell me it was time to focus on building something new, rather than looking back at what had been destroyed. So that's what I did. I started dating again, cautiously at first. A few dinners here and there, nothing serious. Then I met David, an architect who'd lost his own father to cancer and understood grief in a way that didn't require explanation. We'd been together for 8 months now, taking things slowly, building trust carefully. He knew my story, all of it, and had never once suggested I should let go or forgive and forget. "You survived something most people can't imagine," he'd said when I'd told him everything on our 4th date. "The fact that you're still standing, still building, still helping others, that's not about forgiveness or letting go. That's about strength and choosing who you want to be, despite what was done to you." I'd realized then that this was what real support looked like. Not pressure to perform forgiveness I didn't feel, not judgment about my anger or my boundaries, but simple acknowledgement that my feelings were valid and my choices were my own. The Thomas Carter estate had been fully settled now. The commercial property sale had funded the foundation with enough to operate for decades. The investments my father had made were generating steady income that I used partly for personal expenses and partly for charitable giving. I'd kept the house in Westchester, but rented it to a family who needed affordable housing, charging them below market rate because that's what my father would have done. My relationship with money had fundamentally changed. I'd grown up watching my father build wealth slowly and deliberately, always with an eye toward helping others. Then I'd married Derek and watched him destroy wealth recklessly and selfishly, always taking from others. The contrast had taught me that money itself was neutral. What mattered was the character of the person controlling it. I chose to be like my father, not perfect, not a martyr, but someone who understood that wealth was a tool for building rather than a weapon for taking. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at the foundation office. Margaret knocked on my door looking uncertain, which was unusual for her normally confident demeanor. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "She says her name is Patricia Moore, the nurse who testified at the trial." I was surprised but curious. "Send her in." Patricia entered looking nervous, clutching a small envelope. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Ms. Carter," she began, "I know this is unexpected. I've wanted to reach out for 2 years but didn't know if it would be welcome. I wanted to tell you how sorry I am that I didn't speak up sooner about Karen Novak's behavior. If I had trusted my instincts, if I'd reported what I saw, maybe your father would still be alive." I gestured for her to sit. "Patricia, you're not responsible for Karen's choices or for my father's death. You came forward when it mattered. Your testimony helped convict his murderers. That took courage." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I brought you something. I found it when I was cleaning out old files at the office. It's a card your father gave me once after I'd helped him through a particularly difficult appointment. I thought you might want to have it." She handed me the envelope. Inside was a simple thank you card in my father's handwriting. "Patricia, thank you for your kindness and your dedication to healing. The world needs more people like you who care genuinely about others. With gratitude, Thomas Carter. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, feeling the familiar ache of loss mixed with something warmer. This was who my father had been. Someone who noticed when people were kind, who took time to thank a nurse for doing her job well, who saw value in everyone regardless of their position or status. Thank you for this, I told Patricia. It means more than you know. She smiled with relief. Your father was a good man. The foundation you built in his name. It's exactly what he would have wanted. I'm glad something positive came from such tragedy. After she left, I sat holding the card, thinking about inheritance and legacy. Richard Novak had been so focused on stealing my father's financial legacy that he'd completely missed what actually mattered. The kindness, the integrity, the genuine care for others, those were the things my father had truly left me. Those were the inheritance that money couldn't buy and murder couldn't take away. I kept the card in a frame on my desk where I could see it every day, on particularly difficult days. When I questioned whether the foundation was making a real difference or whether justice had truly been served, I'd look at those words and remember what mattered. The world needs more people who care genuinely about others. That evening, David and I had dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown. Over dessert, he asked me something he'd been thinking about for a while. Do you ever regret how things turned out? He asked. Not the justice part, but the loss. Your marriage ending, the betrayal, discovering what Derek had been involved in. Do you ever wish you could go back and not know? I considered the question carefully. No, I finally said. Knowing the truth destroyed the illusion I'd been living in. But illusions aren't real happiness. They're just comfortable lies. I'd rather live in painful reality than beautiful fiction. At least reality gives you a foundation to build something genuine on. That's very wise, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. My father taught me that, I replied. He always said that truth might hurt, but it's temporary pain. Lies hurt forever because they keep you trapped in false stories. He was right about that, like he was right about so many things. 6 months later, the foundation held its second annual gala, a fundraising event to support expanded programming. Over 300 people attended, including many of the business owners we'd helped and supporters who believed in our mission. Margaret gave a speech about the importance of supporting fraud victims. James Rodriguez talked about how the foundation had saved his family's restaurant, and I stood at the podium looking out at all these people who'd come together in my father's name and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. My father used to say that wealth isn't what you accumulate. It's what you leave behind that helps others build their own success, I told the crowd. He didn't just leave me money. He left me values, principles, and an example of how to live with integrity. The people who tried to steal his financial legacy didn't understand that the real inheritance couldn't be taken. It could only be honored through actions that reflected his beliefs. The applause that followed felt like validation not just for me, but for everything my father had built and believed in. As the evening ended and guests began leaving, David found me standing on the balcony overlooking the city. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, and we stood in comfortable silence watching the lights. Your father would be proud of you, he said quietly. I think he would be, I agreed. Not because I'm rich or successful, but because I chose to build instead of destroy. I chose truth over comfortable lies. I chose justice over revenge. Those were his values, and now they're mine. Somewhere across the city, Derek sat in a prison cell contemplating the choices that had led him there. Vanessa worked a minimum wage job, her legal career destroyed forever. Richard Novak lay in a prison hospital bed, his body broken by the stroke that had been brought on by the stress of his conviction. And Karen Novak counted down the decades until she might see freedom again, knowing she'd murdered a man for money she'd never touch. They'd all paid for their greed, their betrayal, their willingness to destroy others for personal gain. Justice hadn't been quick, and it hadn't been neat, but it had been thorough. As for me, I was building a life my father would have been proud of. Not perfect, not without scars, but genuine and purposeful. I'd lost my marriage, discovered terrible truths, and fought for justice against people who'd tried to steal not just my inheritance, but my father's life. And I'd won. Not because I was wealthy, or because I'd destroyed my enemies, but because I'd refused to let their betrayal define me. I'd chosen to honor my father's memory through actions that reflected his values. I'd built something meaningful from tragedy. That was the real victory. That was the inheritance that mattered. What happened to me could happen to anyone. Betrayal, greed, and manipulation aren't unique to the wealthy. They're risks we all face when we trust others with our hearts, our finances, or our secrets. My story isn't special because of the dollar amounts or the dramatic courtroom revelations. It's simply one woman's journey through discovering that the people she loved weren't who she thought they were, and finding the strength to demand justice and build something better. If you've experienced similar betrayal, if you've discovered that family or partners were using you, if you've had to stand up for yourself against people who thought you were too weak or too kind to fight back, I want you to know this. You're not alone. Your anger is valid. Your boundaries are necessary. And choosing to protect yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. The greatest revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building a life so genuine and purposeful that they become irrelevant to your happiness. That's what my father taught me, and that's what I hope his legacy will teach others. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have pursued justice so aggressively or taken a different path? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the most important lessons come from sharing our stories and learning from each other's experiences. Thank you for listening to my story, for supporting the foundation through your interest and engagement, and for being being part of a community that believes in justice, integrity, and the power of truth. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this story resonated with you. My father once wrote, "The world needs more people who care genuinely about others." I'm trying every day to be one of those people. I hope you'll join me in that mission.